Look around a city and you'll see a multitude of stories waiting to be told, but you might not realize just how complex and layered the explanation is. Join our motley cast of urban dwellers and planners as we research, question, and sometimes fall deep down a rabbit hole. I'm Ellen.
I'm Matt.
I'm Tess. And I'm Zach.
And this is Multi-Story.
This week we have an exciting journey to the French Alps, to the beautiful clean lakes of Lake Annecy, to learn about not only a magical place that I've had the privilege of visiting when visiting Tess, but also is doing some interesting stuff. So Tess, do you want to, with that, is that enough suspense?
That sounds pretty good. Hello, friends. I'm
Okay.
very excited to share with you a little bit about where I live and sort of go down the planning rabbit hole with you here. So this is Annecy, just a little bit of an overview, and as a little bit of a background, Annecy's a medium-sized city. About 185,000 people live in Annecy's urban area. And Annecy wraps around Lac d'Annecy, and it's sort of at the base of the French Alps. So to orient you a little bit, it's about 20 miles south of Geneva. It's about 30 miles west of Italy and Mont Blanc. It's about 50 miles north of Grenoble and 60 miles east of Lyon. And Annecy is a very beautiful city and a very beautiful setting. And so that means that there are a lot of people who want to visit, a lot of people who want to live here. But Annecy is also geographically constrained. So it has the lake on one side, it is surrounded by mountains, and in other directions, there's rivers and gorges. And so when you have big inflows and outflows of people in a constrained space, that's sort of a perfect recipe for traffic. So everyone who wants to visit the city, everyone who's going skiing or hiking in the mountains, everyone who's spending the day at the lake, every farmer or logger who's bringing like deliveries down from the mountains, everyone is using the same roads. And this creates some challenges. And so the city of Annecy has developed a new traffic circulation plan to try and address some of those challenges. And this is a slide from a recent presentation by the city that shows some of the streets of the city center sort of clogged with tourists and pass-through traffic. And Annecy is a very bike and pedestrian friendly city. It's also a very environmentally focused city with a long history around improving the water quality in the lake or managing air pollution in the mountains. And so you can see some of that background in the approach that the city is taking to these traffic circulation challenges. So
Tess, not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious, obviously this is talking about car traffic, but I assume the mode share already is, being France and all, is heavily transit, or is it because it's so constrained and sort of diffuse, it's actually more reliant on cars than other peer cities of its size, or is it mostly multimodal?
it is a very bike-friendly city. There's a lot of bike infrastructure. There's a lot of people who bike. There's also a pretty solid transit system. But the buses run into the same constraint that the cars do, is that often there's only one road to get where you need to go, right? Where the mountains meet the lake, there's only so much space. And so the buses sit in the same traffic as the cars. And so, a big part of the puzzle for the city of Annecy is mode shift. Like the fewer cars, the better, whether you're on a walking or on a bike or taking a water taxi or whatever it might be.
Are there
And
water taxis?
in the summer, at certain times of the year, at certain times of day. It's not super functional, but it's a fun
It's
thing to
never
try.
French. It's put it in. You want
Yeah,
a taxi, it shows up
It
when
didn't
you
have an
want
app.
it.
Does it have an app?
Well, I
No.
mean, you can
Only to deliver your food, Matt.
the private water taxis will take you wherever you want to go, whenever you want to go, and it's very expensive. But if you want the transit water taxi, that comes a few times a day.
This is where we mentioned that capitalism ruins everything. Go on, though. What do
Okay.
you have on the screen now?
Okay, so I'm going to walk through several of the things that Annecy's trying to do with the circulation plan. So removing car traffic from sort of the residential areas and focusing on external arterials. So basically, if you're driving through Annecy, if you're getting off the highway and going to the mountains, they're just trying to get all of that traffic out of the center of town, out of the historic center of the city.
They're bulldozing the center of the city and putting a highway right through the middle, the American way.
They in decades past, probably there are some pretty spaghetti highways in Annecy, right? So I think there's some instincts there, but so far the city center is intact. So, and speaking of, one of the things they want to do is eliminate cut through traffic through the neighborhoods. So when main roads get clogged, a lot of times traffic was diverting through the neighborhoods to find shortcuts or to get around the traffic. And so there's an effort to sort of make that impossible, to basically say the only cars entering into the neighborhood are the cars that are going to destinations in that neighborhood. Part of this is sort of creating a hierarchy of different modes. So there's sort of a dedicated network for pedestrians and cyclists that is separate from the car traffic. So cars go in certain routes and bikes and pedestrians go on different routes, and they can get to different destinations, but they're safe and separated. That's part of the story here.
So are they using
They want
bollards or access controls to limit pass-through traffic, or am I getting ahead of the story?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and
Okay.
in part two of this sort of story of Annecy as well. It's a mix of like pedestrianizing streets, dedicated infrastructure, street diversions, street closures, yeah, all sorts of different tools. And with the goal of making those streets and those modes safer and more accessible for people who are walking and biking. So a focus on safety and recognizing the safety impacts of having a lot of car traffic in the middle of a medieval city. Improving the living environment. So there's a focus on bringing more nature into the city and more green into the streets, a focus on improving the air quality, which as a mountain city with a lot of stalled traffic can be an issue. Dealing with noise pollution of a lot of traffic in an old city as well. And then a focus on promoting the social life and connectivity within the neighborhoods. So here's some examples of a little like lending library and some seating space. So not the circulation plan is not just about moving from A to B, but it's sort of creating places where people want to be, where people are more comfortable, that sort of thing.
These are delightful spaces.
Okay. So far, how are we feeling about this? Do you feel like you're all on board with the ANSI circulation plan?
What could go wrong?
I feel good about it, but also those slides where you had all the arrows are wildly confusing to me. So I'm excited for you to explain them because, especially now that you've asked that question, I feel like this is a setup.
It's definitely a setup.
Bulldoze the whole thing. It'll become so busy down there with all the pedestrians and bikers that nobody will want to go there anymore.
That's
Yeah,
true.
exactly.
Pedestrians and cyclists always ruin it.
It's too crowded. Nobody goes there.
There's nowhere to park.
So it is a little bit of a setup, I will confess, but it's a setup for a good cause. So I'm sharing this because it's sort of an interesting case study in how to sort of manage traffic in a historic city core. And the story of like the history and politics of the project has some drama with it, which will be fun to tell. But that's not really what sent me down the rabbit hole because lots of places have traffic and have traffic plans. What caught my attention is the particular approach that Annecy and some other cities in France are taking to manage this traffic. And to sort of tease it out a little bit, I think in some ways their approach to managing this traffic is leaning in the complete opposite direction from what is maybe like the prevailing best practice in the United States. And like the reasons for those differences are really interesting to me. So that's what I want to dig into. But for that to make sense, first I want to change gears a little bit and talk about a subject that I know is very near and dear to you, Matt, which is the grid. Is it fair to say that you are a fan of a good street grid?
I think that's fair. I think I am biased by, I got my education in cities. My party trick was I went to the 40 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And so like I learned cities from maybe bad examples. But the grid obviously it has a lot of benefits. It gives you orderly development lots and patterns that are easy to work with. It's uniform, it's easy to navigate, it's resilient and redundant. So, you've got another street over. I understand that I'm kind of backing myself into a trap here, but I wonder, maybe I'll withhold my question about this, but generally, yes, the grid is sort of an orthodoxy and I think maybe the grid is the holy grail in American urbanism because it's the opposite of the suburban pattern where things don't connect, where things dead end, this is very efficient. Everything's always, to go to the opposite end of your block, you go 2 blocks. In the suburbs, you could go a mile, right? So all those things being said, I think I remain ready to be owned.
No, there's no owning. I think you have touched on the key things here. So you mentioned a lot of this. One of the things the grid does is it provides direct connections. So here's me on one block, and Matt, here you're living on the next block. And since we're on regular street grid, if I want to visit you, I just go out to the street and walk a block, and then I'm there. It's pretty straightforward, or should be pretty straightforward. But in a more suburban context, that's not always the case, right? Because here we're the same physical distance away, but you happen to live in a different subdivision, and these subdivisions that we live in are designed to prevent cut-through traffic, and they happen to both feed into separate arterials. And that means even though you're close by, if I want to visit you, I have to do something like this, which is not very direct. The distance is much longer.
It's literally, you've made a circle.
Yeah.
Just a lot of times when I am in the suburbs, I feel like I'm spiraling, and this is an example of that.
Sorry, Zach.
There's a cross light there. I mean, you're probably going to have to go up another arterial.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's not a signed
Uh,
crosswalk. Good point, Zach.
Could be, could be. Now, that's not to say that the grid is always perfectly direct, right? Because if you happen to live at a 45-degree angle from the direction of the grid, and you remember your Pythagorean theorem, like the distance is about 30% longer than what the shortest distance would be between the 2 points.
This is what
But
drives
in general,
me nuts about the grid. Like I want it to be efficient and it can't be. You have to do 2 sides of the triangle.
Okay,
grid.
y'all, in American urbanism, half of these are parking lots that you can diagonal across.
I know. I'm just saying, the grid has to have pro and cons, and I feel like that's a con.
so another thing here is the grid is flexible. So in this case, I live in the bottom right, and a few blocks away, Matt lives in the upper left. And maybe this is the normal route that I would take to go visit Matt. But Zach and Ellen, you've decided to do a little road construction project on
I'd
our
like
route.
to think of it as a street party.
Okay, okay. It's closed for a block party. You guys are having a little flamingo there, and the street's closed, and I can't drive that way anymore. And on a grid like,
What, Zach?
Guerrilla traffic calming.
That's right.
yeah, exactly. Luckily, there's other routes I can take, and there's not just one alternative. There are many alternatives. So the grid is flexible. Whereas in maybe a conventional suburban context, this normal route to get to Matt is pretty straightforward. But if there's a problem on the arterial where the subdivision exits, maybe there's a traffic accident or something like that that blocks it, you're pretty much out of luck. So not as flexible. Distributed. So basically, this is all of us living our best lives in this grid city, and all of us want to go to the grocery store. And maybe Ellen takes this route, and Matt takes this route, and I go this way, and Zach goes this way, and all of us are going to the same place, but all of us are taking different routes to get there. Our traffic is like dispersed and distributed across the network. And that means that there's not as much traffic on any individual street. And so that means that streets don't need to be as large and take up as much space, or maybe they're more able to accommodate other uses and users because there's no one street that is bearing every trip in the neighborhood because it's, you know, a major arterial. Here we are in our same locations, but trying to navigate in a more sort of suburban context. And Ellen has to go out to the main arterial. So do I. So does Matt. So does Zach. All of us, no matter where we are or where we're going, have to drive on the same road. And so that's where all of the traffic is.
Zach, you could have taken one for a team and turned right out of your subdivision and done 3 sides of a square. Why are you so selfish?
It's got to go the fastest route. That's what Google told me to do.
It's very
He's probably in a self-driving car. It just follows the app, right? So because it's flexible and because it's dispersed, the grid is also resilient. So here you can see all sorts of problems and disruptions on the grid, but it's still possible to navigate around the city and get where you want to go. In a suburban context, same situation, it's pretty much impossible. So the grid is also more legible. And what I mean by that is on a grid, it's easier to know like where you are and where you're going. And so I've blocked out the street sign here. This is in the Kansas City area. Just looking at this scene of like a street and some trees, do any of you know where it is?
State
Just off
line.
the top of your head.
I did the pre-read. I know exactly where this is.
I have
Oh,
in
okay.
State Line Road and 71st. Gregory and State Line. Am I close?
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna guess state line as well.
Okay. Well, that's not where it is, but now when I reveal the street name, do you know where you are?
Yes, I think so.
Right? Yeah. So 55th Street is South Plaza between the Plaza and Brookside, for those who are familiar with Kansas City. So on the grid, just knowing what street you're on and what street is next helps you like orient yourself within the city, within the neighborhood, within the region. Here I didn't bother to block it out. We've left the grid. Here's 2 streets in Kansas City, and even though I picked these, I'm still have trouble finding them on the map when I go and try and pinpoint where exactly I found the spot. And if you guys know where this is,
I actually know exactly
it,
what this is. This is where near where my in-laws live, and I actually love it because it's more of a labyrinth. It's still connected, but it's like a grid where every single one is like a dead end or like tees into another street. And so if you know your way around, it functions like a grid, but everybody else is hopelessly lost.
It looks
Zach,
like
is,
it's
Right.
is this Prairie Village?
No, this is in Roland Park.
Yeah, it's
Little
like
park.
right off Shawnee Mission. I think my sister used to live in this area.
okay. Well, I picked the spot you knew, so that sort of
I didn't-
exercise
I
is
didn't know what
ruined,
Zach
but
was describing, but it's
yeah,
like
yeah.
I think it's
Um,
interesting.
But I think you've hit on something, Zach, which is that it's not that it's legible from the street signs where you are. It's that you over time grew to know the place, right? That's why you know where to go and what it is, because you spent time there and it was sort of known to the neighborhood, but not known to those outside the neighborhood.
So someone who would try to cut through here and is met with the wrong dead end after the wrong dead end is just like, I am never taking this cut through again. I'm not doing this as a shortcut
Right.
next time. This is so stupid.
Yeah. Or if you're like me, just say the suburban streets cause me a lot of stress and I'm just not going to have that be a part of my life anymore. Yeah,
Arterials
you can-
only for tests.
Is this Olathe?
It sure is. And so grids are simple, not in the sense that like a street can't have a lot of things going on, but in the sense that streets meet at right angles, that like visibility for the different users is straightforward, all of the components are uniform, the distances and sort of design and operations of the intersection are like intuitive and straightforward. You know, it's easier to use a street grid. If you're moving around, it's also easier to like build and maintain them and they cost less and things like that. As opposed to something like this, which is an award-winning design that solves a lot of problems, but I don't think we would say this is simple, right? When you don't have a street grid, you have complex intersections that create a lot of complex interactions, and that can be a downside of having a non-grid street layout.
It feels like what happens when, is it Dali who did the melting clock painting.
Dolly.
Dolly.
Yeah.
It feels like what happens when Dolly meets urban planning.
I was gonna say it's
Yeah.
Mario Kart.
Yeah,
What
it's
cart?
Mario Kart. I can hear the little music. Doot, 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 doot.
But you have to know how to operate a roundabout, so can Americans do it?
And shoot red
Well,
turtle.
although it's not really a roundabout, it's a peanut about,
You're a
which
peanut about.
I appreciate.
okay, folks.
I just like knowing that there are peanut abouts.
I want
Um,
to meet the people on the awards committee who chose to give that an award.
I
want to
think
know
I
what
want
their
to
Well,
know
it-
if it was truly award. What kind of award what did it? You said it solved things. I'm intrigued. I'm not ruling out the peanut about as part of my future. I'll be on its side.
I'm not speaking ill of the peanut about. I'm just saying it's not a simple intersection.
Sure.
I
Let
want to make
let
peanut
no
about
one
the zeitgeist word.
yeah, let no one say I besmirched the peanut about.
It's actually a legume. Interesting enough. Go on.
I once designed a Mr. Peanut about. That's a story for another time.
Bing.
Oh, okay. Grids are scalable. So another advantage is it's very straightforward to grow and develop over time. It's very predictable for both the development of a neighborhood, but also the extension of services. These are all some of the perks of the grid. Okay, so the grid has a lot going for it, but all of these examples are mostly talking about the grid in terms of how it functions from a transportation perspective and sort of what it means for how people get around the city. And I want to do a very urban planner thing here and zoom out and look at a more complicated context, because I think it's helpful to remember that like circulation of the traffic is not the reason that most historic American cities are grids. So for American cities, the grid is primarily like a product of like colonialism and capitalism. It was a system, as you mentioned before, Matt, it's a system to like easily organize and subdivide and sell land. And this is a system that it could be, you could develop property like with maximum efficiency, with like no land wasted, and you could capture the maximum value from a parcel. And it didn't require any particular expertise or local knowledge in order to lay out. And so the grid was a system that sort of could be applied anywhere, and it could be applied easily, and it could be scaled endlessly. And so for a growing nation, this was the tool of choice for rapidly growing cities and newly founded cities across the country. And, one of the most famous and aggressive grid expansions was the 1811 plan for Manhattan. And like New York is kind of a good microcosm for all of the forces that were driving this across the country. And you can see here, basically, they gridded everything from the old Dutch city up to the end of the island. And there was so much real estate demand and so much value in this property that there wasn't really any consideration of public space, of public needs, no set asides for civic buildings, no deviations. The grid was laid out in a way to like just absolutely maximize the development potential and profit potential of this growing city. That's the story of New York, but it's similar motives and similar outcomes in cities across the country. And that's not to say that people didn't try other things. So by contrast, the famous, or like the planning famous Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park in New York, he prepared this plan for the Northern Pacific Railroad, a city plan for Tacoma, Washington. And even though he was very famous and prestigious, he didn't propose a grid. And so it was quickly rejected by the civic leaders. And not only was it rejected, it was kind of made fun of. They described his plan as a bunch of melons and pears and sweet potatoes, complained that there were no corner lots, that they wouldn't be able to do business in the city. The downtown of Tacoma today is a grid. It doesn't matter how famous of a landscape architect, designer you are at the time, like just the imperative of maximizing profit won out as these grids were built across American cities.
I mean, it's kind of a grid. It's a network at least.
Yeah,
Would to put the alleys in.
I guess like in using the word "one out," it's as it makes a suggestion that there would be something better about living in a banana neighborhood, and I don't see it meaningfully different. It's just more difficult, but I'm sure going there.
It at least
Well,
feels
I would
more like organic, I guess, to me than the straight up grid.
Well, Olmsted and other folks proposing plans like this wanted to at least like acknowledge that topography existed. They were also like trying to think about safety. So they were like minimizing intersections so as to like minimize crashes and things like that. They wanted to incorporate like civic and public spaces as well. And they just wanted it to not merely be profit driven, but also like a pleasant place to walk around, right? Which sounds reasonable.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
a nice curving boulevard kind of draws you along instead of, just a disappearing point in the distance of a straight line.
yeah. Don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to debate the merits here in a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out again. So we're talking about the grid and its transportation effects and how it's going to relate to this Annecy circulation plan. But in the United States, the grid was not really a transportation tool. But the way that it developed in the US is also not the only way that it happens because, colonialist, capitalist real estate speculation is not the origin of the grid. Street grids show up all the way back to the beginning of civilization and cultures around the world for all kinds of different reasons at all kinds of different times. This is a grid street in the ancient city of Babylon. Mohenjo-daro in what is now India had a grid in 2600 BC that was part of like a spiritual philosophy that was like connecting human living spaces to like the cosmic order.
I'm in.
That's actually my main reason for liking grids. as
Yeah,
well.
I suspected maybe cosmic order was part of it. Ancient China used grids as sort of political and cosmic diagrams as well. There were grids in ancient Greece, and they used the grid system to like organize different districts and functions and social classes in the city. But they also used grids when they sort of had imperial or colonial ambitions that they wanted to impose on other places. Roman cities are very connected to a grid, and that's, Roman grids often had a military role, and Roman military camps were laid out as a grid, and often cities were designed to replicate those camps or vice versa. This is medieval France. These bastides used grids for like defense and trade, and sometimes to like displace heretics. This is
Go
a
on.
French.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Tell us
like
more
this
about
is perfect
displacing.
for me. I'm being a heretical, and I'm gonna go to this nice gridded medieval town. I love it.
Right. There was a market in the center. Is that where the heretics got disgraced?
Or disgraced and displaced, I suppose. So this is also a French besieged city, but I showed this one because you see how each block north or south from the center gradually gets longer. This is a street grid that was designed to sort of reflect universal mathematical and geometric principles. So the length of each block is the same length of the diagonal of the previous block. So there you go.
What's up with the Pentagon looking like it looks like they tried to do one suburb in the left side there?
Well, I think even the best laid grid runs into the reality of planet Earth every once in a while.
A little bit of whimsy, just a little Pentagon hanging out.
I think it's a parking lot actually. That's breaks everything.
They didn't have one, so
Dutch cities sometimes use grids to sort of maximize canal frontage. Teotihuacan and other ancient American cities use street grids for like astronomical and ritual reasons.
about had an aneurysm because you were saying Teotihuacan while I'm looking at Tenochtitlan, and I was like, that's not anyway.
Well, Teotihuacan's on the right.
I see that now, but the label Tenochtitlan is much bigger. Draws the eye. Go on.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Aneurysm is done.
Everyone's a critic. Okay, so back to the United States. This is the original plan of Philadelphia, which is also a grid. But I learned as I was doing this, William Penn designed this with the goal of like keeping homes and businesses spread absolutely as far apart as possible. So the purpose of the grid was just to have gardens and orchards in between everything. He wanted Philadelphia to feel like the rural England countryside and not a city. It wasn't long before Philadelphia was very, very different. But the origin of this grid was
Thank
sort of
goodness.
like rural pastoralism. One of the most famous grids, Savannah, Georgia, James Oglethorpe's plan was shaped by Enlightenment principles. So this is a grid that's supposed to represent rationality, a vision for social equity and civic virtue. So all of that's to say that the grid is very adaptable. It doesn't really espouse any specific culture or system or even like functional framework for how cities work. There's no like immutable rule that cities with a street grid have to have it for a particular reason, or that it has to function in a particular way, or that it will shape a city in a particular way. And so all of these conversations that we're having, these like contemporary planning conversations about the functional characteristics of the street grid for transportation and circulation and development, et cetera, I kind of want to pitch to you that those are all kind of like post hoc analysis of a consequence of the grid that's sort of a second order incidental thing that is happening that's not related to why the grid was there in the first place, which I think is helpful to keep in mind as we think about the decline of the grid, right?
However,
So
accidentally awesome is still awesome, right?
Or for the grid itself.
Yes.
You're still on
I'm,
team
I'm
grid.
just, I feel
yeah,
like I've been put in
it,
this corner and I'm going to go down swinging.
It's called
well,
inadvertent
yeah.
brilliance.
I mean, we all of us are evolving to be crabs eventually, right? It's like a convergent urban design, maybe,
Crabs are
is your
crabby.
pitch.
I feel like all you did was talk up the grid now, and I feel like you are really just like raising us higher and higher with the distinct goal of just watching us fall for the next 10 slides.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Where we go.
That's a non-answer
Um,
if I've ever heard one.
I don't know that I'm judging it either way. I think I want to paint a picture that explains that these grids weren't built for transportation reasons. And so when we look at those transportation benefits that we discussed, those weren't necessarily in mind or in front of mind as alternative forces pushed American cities in different directions. And so I think it'll help us understand a little bit why the grid in American cities went away, but it's also going to be relevant to what's going on in Annecy as well, I promise. Okay, so Let's start with this quote from a famous urban historian, Lewis Mumford. The new gridiron plans were spectacular in their inefficiency and waste by usually failing to discriminate sufficiently between main arteries and residential streets. The first were not made wide enough, while the second were usually too wide for purely neighborhood functions. As for its contributions to the permanent social functions of the city, the anonymous gridiron plan proved empty. Lewis Mumford was not a fan.
It's not a very mixed
And
use mentality, but yeah, go on.
okay, so where is this ire coming from? Here we're looking at a block in Manhattan. To run through a lot of history and condense it and simplify it a lot, by the mid 1800s, the nation was industrializing. Cities were getting polluted and crowded and very dense, and all of the ills of that urban environment were often blamed on the grid design of the cities because these grids were designed to maximize development potential and profit. But if you lay out a city for maximum development potential and then you develop it to its a maximum amount, which was there was pressure to do because there was so much population increase in these cities as they were industrializing, there is no space left for anyone or anything really. So you can see here what were designed as 25-foot wide lots with a single family home over time began to house tenement buildings with maybe 30 or more households. There were periods of time in New York where individual blocks had 2,000 to 3,000 people in them, entire cities living in a single block. It created like really horrible, squalid living conditions. So I've highlighted some of the descriptions here. Probably the worst legalized building form in the world. A growing belief that the grid could not serve as the frame for socially equitable development. It was a source of intractable source of urban misery, and it denied the people who were living there their inalienable rights to light and air and sunshine.
It's missing an alley.
Did anybody play Sim Tower? That picture reminds me of Sim Tower.
I
Great
did
game.
not play Sim Tower. Is it like Sim City, but it's for
I,
one
Like
apartment
Sim
building?
City, yeah, but it's like a mega building.
I did it
No,
for a
you
hot
did.
minute.
I feel like this explains a lot about both of you in a good
So
way.
be it. Yeah, highly
Um,
educated in towers.
okay. So like dense and crowded and unsanitary living conditions. But the other sort of knock against the grid was that these grids were built and implemented before the automobile. And as automobiles became more prevalent, there was not yet that sort of desensitizing to all of the violence that cars cause. And there also wasn't an expectation yet that if you were a pedestrian, you weren't allowed to actually like use the street and be in the street. And so all of these crowded people of the cities were in the streets and all these cars were driving around. And it was extremely dangerous. So all of these grids felt like besieged islands by these cars, described as the scene of a virtual slaughter, as all of the cars filled up with automobile traffic and all of this dense life. People didn't have open space. The grid wasn't designed for any. They didn't have public spaces or civic uses. They were in the streets to live their lives. And when the cars arrived, it was a recipe for a lot of like danger and death. Okay. So those are just a couple high level examples of some of the like forces pushing against the grid pattern and problems people were having with it. And if we recognize that the grid wasn't really developed from a transportation perspective, I think it makes sense why people began to shift away. So like, why should we adhere to what is at its core like a tool for value extraction from a place by developers and speculators that ignores the geography and the environment where it's imposed? It ignores public spaces and uses and services. It facilitates the development of horrific slums with no space allocated for like nature or sanitation or even light. And with the advent of the automobile, it sort of facilitated a massacre of people in the street. This is the kind of general sentiment is
But
This is
pushing
why?
the
people
poning.
away from the grid.
Yeah, I guess I just don't understand why that's the grid. Like the car would have messed up any system, and the lack of green space could have been green space could have been neglected with any sort of property division technique, right? I get the topography thing. That's pretty compelling, actually. I guess I don't put all the rest of these things at the feet of the grid. Like any system could have had the same faults. Although I guess if you break up the massing and things like that, you kind of force some variation.
Yeah, I mean, I think your thoughts on how to adapt that situation, that's what everyone else was doing as well, trying to figure out how to adapt to these evolving forces to make places more livable. So, and not all of them were rejections of the grid. Some of them were adaptations to the grid. So, right, like this is Clarence Perry's famous sort of neighborhood unit, and his response to this set of circumstances was rather than having a grid as a frame for separate development blocks, the grid would be these major arterials that framed neighborhoods. So that all of the busy traffic would be located on these external arterials. You could front the intense uses, the commercial shops and things like that on those exterior uses. And the interior, you could focus park space, you could focus community space, and you could have local streets that served the neighborhood but weren't used for that busy business and cut through traffic. So a very sort of, again, planner famous evolution of American cities was this idea of the neighborhood unit.
I like this, and I feel like this refers back to how we were talking on an earlier episode of like the small communities that you can build. Like everything kind of has to be self-contained. Like even just at the top left where it says, 160 acres, it should house just enough people for one elementary school. Like that would be such a natural grouping of neighbors, assuming that everyone in the neighborhood's going to the school.
Yeah, this is the
Yeah.
streetcar suburb, right? This is Brookside. This is Armor Hills, or those J.C. Nichols master planned neighborhoods.
We're starting to go the direction of pushing all of the traffic onto the arterial streets. And then that's where the car sewer comes in, makes it impossible to cross these streets.
Was this another setup, Tess? God damn it.
I'm not here to judge one way or the other. I'm just sort of telling the story of how we got from A to B. This did make me think a little bit about, the very contemporary 15-minute cities as well, though. It's a similar idea that everything you need is in your neighborhood and everyone has access to park space, everyone has access to community facilities. This is
Everyone will
not,
be locked into their neighborhood and not allowed to leave.
depending on which conspiracies you subscribe to.
I think the only
Okay.
Yeah,
solution is
I
to
mean,
ban
I
cars.
thought of the same thing when I saw that. Sorry, Zach, go ahead.
Only solution is to ban cars.
I love it. I'm on. Let's do it.
Okay.
Somebody's already
Well,
running that podcast, though. We have a different angle.
We have an angle of acceptance and living together and like kumbaya, Zach. Quit it with your just get rid of things.
Maybe.
We're a flamingo podcast, not a ban the world podcast.
I don't know. The group feels pretty schizophrenic to me, I have to say. I don't know.
Ban cars or demolish it all.
Ooh,
Um,
Save
Will
it,
you-
and the cars can go anywhere.
burn it to the ground.
A nihilism
Okay.
podcast.
So
Go
I have
on,
to keep,
Tess.
I have to keep going, or we're never going to make it out of the 1920s. Okay, this is Radburn, New Jersey. This was an early built example that used these like external super blocks. And you can also see it begins to use these street hierarchies, the separation of different modes. You see the incorporation of open space, so people have access to nature, but you also see how they have made cut-through traffic impossible. So all of that concern of the danger of cars, one of the ways people address that is to make it impossible for cars to cut through. Then the only people driving on that street are the people who live there. I think we know what that leads to. We see in Radburn the early prototype for the ubiquitous cul-de-sac. And again, since the car traffic can't connect through, it's much more calm. But note here in Radburn, the pedestrian connections do connect through. So there's a separation of mode hierarchies and the cars don't connect, but the pedestrians do. This is Ludwig Heibersheimer proposed, I'm sure I messed that up, but basically had a system where you would transform the conventional gridded city through sort of an orderly program of street closings and selective demolitions. And in the end, you would sort of have these neighborhoods separated by park belts, and they would be safe from traffic through cul-de-sacs, and you would have these arterials as part of this like super block hierarchy. A few decades later, this is the Garden City of Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom, and you can see here there is a grid, but it's a grid as part of a street hierarchy, and the grid is sort of amorphous as it follows natural features. And also, each block of the grid sort of surrounds an entire neighborhood. And those neighborhoods are like inwardly focused. There's limited access in and out. And they're like, so this is like an adaptation of the grid that's trying to deal with the problems that those crowded, industrializing, chaotic cities were facing before.
Raise your hand if you've been to Milton Keynes. It's just me.
Looks pretty nice.
I
It's
haven't, but now it's on my short list next time I'm in the UK.
just so you can one up me.
No, I just want to
No.
be able to share the experience.
There you go.
I haven't been there, but from my Google visit, it doesn't look super interesting from the ground. So, speaking of garden cities, the reconnection of people with nature was also like a big force in the changing of city design. It was like a matter of health, but also like virtue. So, like city slums were like dense and dirty and wretched. And so, if you were anti-urban, that was seen as more virtuous. And that's sort of a theme that continues to permeate, I think, in perceptions of American cities a little bit.
That
This
thing was
is
trippy, man. That wheel of I'm gonna have to stare at that for like hours. Actually, go on. Sorry.
so this is an example of a garden city in Riverside, Illinois, one of the first planned suburbs in the United States. And you can see here in this plan, it's sort of designed to resist the harmful influences of the city. So there's a very distinct contrast with like the rigidity and artificiality of the grid. It's responsive to topography. There's curved streets. It's also places that were designed to be sort of exclusive and private and homogenous, and with the idea that the less urban they were, the more prestigious and virtuous they were as well.
And they built this thing. I actually just like pulled it up. Like, okay, yep, you're going there. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a suburb of Kansas City, and I think it's representative of a lot of today's American suburbs. And I think it's fair to say that these are sort of like a copy of a copy of a copy of original of idea. And so they've lost a lot of like the rationale and benefits of those initial schemes. But you can sort of still see those influences. So there's a hierarchy of streets. You don't have through traffic on local streets in order to keep traffic away from homes and like kids playing out front. Neighborhoods that are like self-contained and inward facing, they're sort of become these social units. And, we sort of still use these sorts of neighborhoods to identify community association today in all kinds of different ways. There's at least some kind of response to natural features and topography, with trails and greenway connections between the neighborhoods. So we've solved it, right? The contemporary American suburb is the epitome of community design.
Yeah, that's where I leave.
Yeah.
Disagree.
Okay,
I've got
so
a rad burn for that. Sorry, that was a back reference.
Okay, so tell me what you don't like about this, because I think that's helpful. I've torn down the grid, but this is where it's left us. And what are the problems with this?
It's not connected anymore. Like the houses are all in one spot, so you've got to get in your car to go to the other spot. And I feel like in the Riverside one, the mock-up for it was like the river is not actually activated, and like there's this super cute creek here, so it's like, is there a trail running here, or is that just gonna bring up people who are gonna hang out by the river and put their needles in the water and all those NIMBY things? But like, is this actually activating the world around it, or is it just like nestling in there?
Yeah, I think in the American context, this isn't a means of community, it's a means of isolation. It's like,
Yeah.
get me down the end of a block next to a field.
Like the way you said, it's the inward facing. It's like, why would like that automatically closes you off from like being connected even to the grocery store, the library, the school. Like it's, yeah, there is a bit of the benefit from like, the kids playing in the street, but we also don't have that current society. So
I want to be
It's
a little
also
contrary.
intentionally. Oh, go ahead,
And I've
Zach.
been to some super fun, like all, parents' parties at like a giant suburban house where like the kids are just let loose in the basement and like you just have like endless square feet of like easy, comfortable fun. So there's that.
there is that the pro, that's the pro
But
column.
that's the building. That's like the topology
That's
of
the
the
building.
housing. Yeah,
Right.
not the street.
And is not connecting you to the community. It is you invited people to your house who you like. You don't have to be from that community to be the only person at that house. You just
Yeah, and
happen
then
to know their
everybody has to
kids.
drive home on these like enormous.
Curvy, dervy streets.
Yeah, that's
well,
like a
fine.
counterpoint because there's like no
I-
outside public space for you to just do that in a safe
There's-
way.
There's
Yeah.
no flamingling.
Okay,
I do have to go because I have to go pick up my kids.
Bye,
Are you gonna
Zach.
go
Okay.
take them to a suburban basement?
No, not. Yeah, we're having a birthday party at our house, so it's a little tiny.
So it's
19
your basement.
They're not going to the basement. My basement is like a creepy dungeon, unfinished, like water dripping. It's not good.
Builds character.
Didn't know how to do basements in the 40s, I'll tell you that.
In the 90s, you would have just said, go down there anyway, kids. These kids are snowflakes. Bye, Zach.
Bye.
Thanks, Zach.
bye,
See you
thank
later.
you. Okay, so for all of the reasons you've said and more, there is now in the US, I think, a prevailing wisdom to sort of swing the pendulum back the other way, right? To have communities that are more connected, more dense, more adaptable, less homogeneous, etc. And that makes sense to me. I'm not a big fan of what's on the screen here. In my role as sort of storyteller here, I may assume the mantle of an advocate for whatever this is, but I don't personally subscribe to cul-de-sacs. They make me uncomfortable.
Keep going.
But I want to, with all of that in mind, I want to come back to that plan we liked for the circulation of traffic in Annecy, because I presented it to you and everyone said, yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay.
I feel like we're being
They had a goal of-
misrepresented, Matt. I don't think we were that subscribed to anything.
I said, what could go wrong, knowing that something was going to go wrong.
So help me out real fast here, Tess. So which plan are these both illustrations of the plan they want to implement, or what's the top and what's the bottom? What do I need to understand here?
The two on the left are the old circulation plan. The one on the right is the new one, but they all
Okay.
show the same thing, which is that there's a focus on getting through traffic out of the center to these big arterial roads.
Okay.
And in the center of the city, they don't want people cutting through, more or less. So basically what the header says, they want to remove car traffic from residential areas and focus it on external arterials,
Okay.
which is exactly what the goal was with these super blocks in Radburn, New Jersey. They want to eliminate cut-through car traffic in neighborhoods because the car traffic is obnoxious and noisy and polluting and not safe. That's exactly what all of these schemes that were proposing residential street hierarchies and cul-de-sacs were doing, was removing the cut-through automobile traffic, even as they permitted other modes to penetrate through. There was a goal to create a hierarchy of different modes with like dedicated bike and pedestrian networks that are separate from car traffic. That's exactly what we see in these neighborhood designs in the US, the United Kingdom. The one on right is Milton Keynes again, and the red lines are like the trail and cycle network that is a separate network from the street network that connects those different things. There's a separated hierarchy. They want to make the streets safer and more accessible for those walking and biking. That was a key feature of these sort of non-grid suburban designs, is to deal with the safety impacts of this automobile traffic in the streets. And they wanted to bring nature back into the city. So cleaner air, greener streets, that's a key part of these concepts that we're moving away from the grid.
The slumless, smokeless cities.
And they wanted to promote social life and connectivity in the neighborhoods, which was a very strong feature of these evolving suburbs. The neighborhood unit as an organizing force for social activity where people came together around community uses. Okay, so the challenges that Annecy was facing with traffic, safety, quality of life are very similar to the challenges that arose with those American grid cities. The solutions that Annecy is considering to address those challenges are also very similar to those that were embraced by American cities as they suburbanized. And if we go back to these benefits of the grid that we talked about, and we think about what Annecy is proposing, you can argue that what they're proposing is less direct, it is less flexible, it's less distributed, it's less legible, it's not as simple, and it's not easy to scale.
For cars.
Yeah, for
But
cars. Go on.
it feels, well, I was gonna say, it feels pretty nice, right? Like
Right.
I live here and I'm in it and it feels good. So,
Oh my God, that guy's gonna hit my bus. Okay. He didn't do it. He waited.
okay. So I ask you, friends, is this a good idea, what they're proposing to do? And if you do think it's a good idea, what distinguishes it from the suburban neighborhoods that so many American cities are trying to plan away from?
I guess I am operating a bit under the assumption that Odyssey doesn't want to, they're not going to be destroying anything. So they have a bit of the benefit of it's an old established city. They're not trying to build it from scratch. They are trying to kind of retrofit some of these best practices using like picking and choosing what will work for their situation. So I feel like there are at least, did they learn from all of the things that you just presented? Or was it like they had a big meeting and everybody thought they were having these thoughts for the first time and they've discovered that they just were at square zero?
So if I hear you correctly, you're sort of saying maybe the problem wasn't with the concepts, it was how they were applied in American cities. And maybe now in ANSI, having learned lessons over many decades, they can more effectively implement some of those ideas. Is that?
Yes. Of course, that's
Okay.
what I was saying. Yes.
Okay. So I feel like that's a very solid take. It's not that the idea of those American suburbs was wrong. It's just that the way they ended up getting developed fell away from ideals,
Yes.
and that there is conceivably a good way to do the things that they were trying to do.
Yes. And I feel like the end goal started to be lost once like the suburban things started to kind of emerge. So I'm thinking of the Riverside city that was like designed to be safe and walkable, but it was like designed to be you walk around your block in a safe way and you do absolutely nothing but have a nice walk. Like you're on a street and you're safe to go for a walk, but you have not walked to the store, you have not walked to your school or your work or to like run an errand. If you needed to do any of those things, you would still get in your car and drive there. It just so happens that you are now driving on a safe street. So I feel like there's this difference, like had they kind of kept both things in mind, maybe they wouldn't have wound up with the design they had.
Yeah, I
Did I give the
interjected.
answer? Go, Matt.
I interjected this as you were presenting, Tess, but I feel like they didn't break the grid. They just broke it for the cars, right? Like the grid's benefits on a more human scale, they've just prioritized. And all those previous examples had clear mode preferences or hierarchies. So I think it's just basically like it's a car reduction scheme, which makes every place better, while the interiors will still function in terms of like the layout, practically speaking, of the way that the city works. So sure, if we want to, I'm cool with like breaking some streets. Although we're going through this in Kansas City now, we're putting a park over the South Loop, and they want to close the streets, and now we're worried like, is it going to block our tram because we can't? Anyway, that's a long story. Like we break the grid without doing these other interventions or do it systematically in the way that maybe Aussie's doing it, to think like we're keeping it all on the outside. We break it in piecemeal ways, and that has much more damage than this more intentional like car mitigation strategy. But I don't know. I mean, all the criticisms that we have for the American suburban design system are not here, right? They're not, it's not intended to exclude and disconnect and disorient and all those things. It's intended to kind of the opposite.
Well, there is an emphasis on a street hierarchy. They do intend to push all of the traffic onto a small number of undersized streets with the knowledge that they will be very congested. And that's not so different than a Kansas City suburb where the section line arterials, that is a grid 1 mile apart, right? So in that sense, if you're saying that what ANSI's doing is breaking up the grid for the cars, that I would say that's sort of what's happening, say, in Johnson County, Kansas as well, right? There's a hierarchy and there's a grid for the cars, which is spaced out, and in between the grid for the cars, there's connections and safer spaces for people.
Yeah, I mean, I can ride my
playing
bike
devil's
around.
advocate.
Right. Well, I can ride my bike anywhere in Aussie, and I can't ride my bike in Overland Park, right? Like I got to go through I can't cut through the subdivision. It doesn't go through. I got to go around and die on an arterial and then go a mile and then back in, per your previous example. Like maybe you could
Yeah.
retrofit the suburbs, and people talk about doing that in the United States, but
That's what I was thinking when you said that. Even it's like Ansi has the benefit of, I think, just more connectivity to begin with. But like if you were to take this and apply it to another space, even to the suburbs, I was thinking of like where some of my family lives, like their suburban neighborhood backs up to what is a strip mall but has some great restaurants in it. But it's like it's exactly what you showed, Tess, when it was like, I want to visit Man, and so I have to go around all of these ways. Like in order to get from like something that's literally like just here to there, but there's a creek, there's some reason there's not a pedestrian connection there. And it's like I just kind of wonder if the retrofit, this idea of, okay, well, we did it. The grid is not actually the holy grail that we want it to be. The suburbs that we overcorrected to where we see that it's wrong. So kind of what is this meet in the middle? And is it, I guess my thought in all of this is that maybe it is just finding those ways of making things more interconnected without defaulting to it needing to be for a car. It can just be for moving someone around. So I think, I know Zach has left us for the day, but when he said like just blow up all the cars from the roads, like get rid of all of them, I feel like I would be fine with that too, as long as, you come in, like the vacuum from that explosion needs to be filled with the interconnectivity that allows you to get around in other ways, other
Yeah,
modes.
I think in some of ANSI's traffic analysis, they describe knowing that the roads don't have enough capacity to handle the traffic. And I think an American instinct would be to expand those roads.
Hmm.
And in ANSI, the instinct is that hopefully it's so miserable for drivers that those trips disappear, sort of the opposite of induced demand, right?
I wonder, it's a disincentive if It's like a guarantee that you are going to sit in traffic. It's a disincentive to drive. It's an
Right. And
incentive to find something else.
I think that is just a like political and cultural thing that's possible here that's maybe not possible in a place like
Mhm.
Kansas City. But I wonder if, you're describing the way the suburbs work now and why they're so frustrating, right? Like you live across the creek from the store, but it's like if you take the sidewalk, you have to go a mile to get there. If those suburbs were designed a little more thoughtfully and a little more intentionally, if there was like a trail that cut through back to the creek and there was a bridge across to the shopping
Right.
center, say, or if on your little integrated into your homogeneous single family home subdivision, there were like intentional shared spaces that weren't just part of someone's yard. In your mind, would that be sufficient to redeem those spaces or not? And I ask because, in a previous episode, we looked at some AI images of some sort of garden city, medium density suburbs that you all were pretty down on, and I thought looked pretty okay. And so my sense is that like
How dare you use
those
my words against me?
that some of those little remediations would not cut it for you, right? Like that there is something about a separation of uses or a low density that is intolerable for a lover of cities in any regard, no matter how many trail connections you make along the Greenway Creek, right? But the reason I ask these questions is because all of the sort of institutional instincts of the circulation plan are pushing it away from the things that American urbanists are striving for. They're absolutely embracing each of these tools and features that were a hallmark of American suburbanization, right? And so if in those you can see a way where it works and it feels good and it's successful, like what does that mean for how we design or improve American cities? What does it mean for the potential of the suburbs? What does it mean for how we might think about how our dense urban centers could be more livable or accommodating to a wider variety of demographics or interests or ages or whatever. I think that's the part that interests me.
It does feel like maybe the first example that I've seen where they're thinking about everything maybe together, and maybe that's just how you presented it, Tess, with all of the context in the background. But it seems like they've they're not just sitting there saying, well, like we have to reconnect things. So reconnect them. They're not just saying we have to gridify it, so gridify it. It's kind of taking that step back and saying what has worked, what has not worked on for everything. What is it that we can implement? Kind of how I think we've mentioned on this show before. It's like every city is going to wind up being unique in that. So how do all of these best practices apply to what we're working with here at ONS? And I think I I don't mean Kansas City is probably a bad example of making things progressive. I don't know. Maybe we're all just too jaded about like the particular suburbs we live in, but it seems like some of those little shifts can go a long way in the mode shift if we can encourage things that are like the suburbs aren't necessarily far apart, but they are really inconvenient to get anywhere if you're not in your car. But if you can make the sidewalks safer or like, expand them for so that you have a bike trail on the side, like you probably are close to your library, you probably are close enough, like, within a couple miles of your grocery store. So how can you shift it in a way that makes sense to your exact setup, whether you are a suburban place or an urban place? I don't know. Matt, you're
Yeah.
being
And
suspiciously quiet.
Well, I think my reaction to the overall, sorry, my camera broke. I don't know what happened. So I had to switch. The overall idea of like tolerance of lower density. I guess I think Tess, your instinct that like our reflexive response as American urbanists of like anything that echoes suburban form is icky automatically is a fair critique. Like there are things that we could take from that.
This is
But
where I think we are feeling how much we miss Zach, who
there's a
lives.
wizard back there that
There's
can
a wizard right
transform.
there.
I also think though, like when saying like our tolerance for lower density, like at some point, like lower density is just cannot deliver amenities, walkable amenities at human scale. That's what I care about. Like I don't actually really care if you want to make the streets all squiggly giggly and it's really truly dense and I can like walk without going around, I'm down.
I feel like squiggly giggly is something a wizard says when they cast a spell.
I
The
was
wizard
inspired.
unfortunately can't hear you, but
Oh,
I
okay.
think it actually, you saying that reminds me of the other thing that I had thought about this, which is like the way London has zero grid, like one of the oldest cities. And because of that, it was like developed definitely not on purpose. And like you can, if you understand what you're looking at, you like feel the way that these cities were formed by human feet and horse hooves and not by cars and a grid and trying to make it all purposeful. And so, like, that is still a really walkable city, still a really convenient city to live in. So it's possible to have squiggly diggly streets without suffering the far awayness of this.
Yeah, this is just
I hear you.
pedestrianization at the end of the day. I don't think it's breaking things.
Yeah.
It's just uh,
Yeah.
taking the cars out of the center, which is like a proven tactic, right?
And I think all of you are sort of touching around this idea that it's not necessarily a problem with the concept, it's about what specifically is getting implemented in what way and in what context. And I think that is the perfect segue because part two of this conversation, this isn't hypothetical. They're doing this on the ground. They started to implement it, and I'm out there looking at it, but it hasn't all been smooth sailing. There is a backlash from business owners. There are like political fallouts. The mayor's majority, this may cause them to lose the next round of elections. And meanwhile, they're doing lots of very different, very specific, very tactical things to try and implement those goals. So stay tuned for the next episode, and we can put the debate to rest and like see what actually happens and see if we like that.
There's
The
risk
next
that there's such strong backlash that you put a highway right through the middle of town, right? Well, will there be a tune in next time? Will there be a highway right through Tessa's apartment?
But she just moved.
Yeah, so yeah, stay tuned for that next time. We'll see how it's actually going and see if that changes anyone's mind about what we're doing.